All right. Our next speaker is Martin Scoben of Utrecht University, and he's going to be talking about towards the FAIRification of lab data.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Martin Schobben. I'm the actual scientist working in the lab. And my talk is going to be a bit different than the other talks that were before. So it's more a proposal. So from the experiences from my side when working in the lab. And essentially, it's a sort of a process. So like moving towards the FAIRification of lab data, because believe me, I've seen a couple of labs and there is not much of fair data in many situations. So it's not accessible and it's also not well described often. So what I want to ask actually from you is sort of input into a solution. So a sort of an integrated solution to get towards this goal of a more open science lab. And I'm going to share some of my views here, and I hope that I get some feedback from you guys, the experts. So when we consider a chemical laboratory, you might think of the wet chemical processes taking place there. So your volumetric glasses and your Erlenmeyers and your solutions. And of course, also there's still a lab book. So you have a lot of analog data being recorded. There are, of course, also some digital solutions for that. But as we have seen already also in a couple of other talks, there's also quite complex machinery operating in many of these labs. And this machinery also produces a lot of data, digital data. So this is going to be the emphasis of the talk. So to briefly give you an idea of what's going on in a chemical laboratory. So when I get to the lab, I have a collection of samples. You want to analyze them also often in a quite rapid pace. You want to define a couple of characteristics of the sample. So it's not often that it's confined to just one parameter, but it's like multiple parameters. Luckily, many of these processes are partly or completely automatized in the lab. So that means that you can sort of set up a sequence of samples during the day and leave it running overnight. And then in the morning, you can pick up your data set. So of course, we are dealing with software and computer systems. And then at the end, we have this very complex data sets, often like these multifaceted data streams, very large data streams also in some instances. As we have also seen yesterday, for instance, for the omics. I don't have any experience on that, but from the chemical point of view, you also have some machines that can really create millions of observations. And just as to give you an idea, here in italics, I list a couple of machines that I just used for one particular project that I was involved with. So you have your odd like spectrometers, you have your microscopes, the scanning electron microscopes, something that is maybe quite inconspicuous, a balance, which is actually quite important to record that data as well. And so the question is then, can we better integrate all this data and make it more accessible and also findable? So to recap a little bit what I talked about before. So we go now from a lab, so the wet chemistry in the past, bonus point for the person who knows which famous experiment this is. And we moved then to a situation. This is actually a lab at Utrecht University at the geoscience department, where we have a couple of machines gathered around. And what is actually kind of important here is then that we have our local desktop PC, which is often very crucial as being able to control the machine, record the data, process the data, and also storage most of the time. So storage is still in the lab. So what it's about, it's then you have a couple of big vendors. You have your Thermo Fisher, for instance, and I dealt a lot with Kamika, manufacturer of these machines. and they come often with their default commercial software. But what it does is that you lose sight of part of the processing of the data and also the transformations that take place to assess also, for instance, the reproducibility of your study and so forth. So you prevent part of this data lifecycle. It's sort of blocked from view. You have the fragmented storage, as I said before. So you have these local PCs that store data. And when you think about monitoring and troubleshooting processes in the lab, it's often confined to just the current analysis, not over longer time periods, for instance, or not integrated processes within the lab. You can also envision that if a scientist creates a solution that was off, a stock solution, if you combine multiple data sets, you might be able to track that down and to the source, to the wrong stock solution. So to give it in a graphical overview, so we have our lab equipment. This often produces an entry point. This is the raw data. This is often accessible. And then you have the process data, which is now often done by these vendor proprietary software suite of the vendor that does the processing for you. So these would be the visible points then. And on the bottom, like the processing of the signal from the lab to the raw data and the data reduction itself, that's a sort of a black box, which is encased by the vendor. I'm gonna not talk about the signal processing anymore, but especially about this data reduction process here, and also about whether we can use this raw data. So to do the actual reduction of the data yourself to maybe gain some more insights. So we want to open up this black box of the lab data. So you have your GUI-based dashboards and often, and wizards and dialogues that hide part of these transformations and calculations. But actually we want to trace back the origin of the data. So get really back to the raw data, and actually found this quite interesting study that sort of underpins this as well. This is not my subject of research, but this is more like synthetic compound production and then the definition of these compounds. And what they suggest in the study is that it seems that a lot of these synthetic compounds, when you have elemental analysis, that there are some dubious manipulations, and they don't know exactly where that lies. But they suggest that the solution to that would be to also give the raw data to the reviewers so that they can better understand how they came to the final value. I think what is also an interesting fact is that if you open up this black box, you can maybe work with old and defunct machinery. Sometimes you have a really like legacy systems running, Windows XP, for instance, to be able to run this particular software suite because the technician is just used to it, or there is no other update. And sometimes it is really also a machine that doesn't, well, it functions still, but there is really no software at hand, or you only have the data. So maybe you want to still work with that. Of course, you can ask the question then, is more data better? So I think often in unexpected ways, when you like really deal with data from the source, you can come to new insights and maybe also new innovations, because now we leave it often in the hands of like the commercial vendors to do these transformations for us, these calculations and these reductions. I think it also produces an incentive for inclusive science. So if you can already publish your raw data, you can also leave that to other people to start working with this data, because some of these processes and some of these analyses in the lab are really expensive. So that would be the sort of the use case that I have in mind here. And then, of course, already pointed towards it, it would also lead to more transparent science. So you can have proof of your final published value. So the situation as it is now, I call it now the Unconnected Lab. So you have then your machine, You have your local desktop PC, and you have then this fragmented storage, and we have these transformations that are out of sight. So what we want to go to more of an integrated process, and that's why I contacted these people here from IRADS. So we want to or it would be a good way to like centralize the storage. So we have to collect the data from all these odd different machines, harmonize it some way, and then you could also think about picking up this workflow that is now encompassed by the vendors and make open sourced software for that as well. That will be a phase further in the future. And you can also start with the online monitoring of these integrated data streams within the lab. So over time, but also the different machines and different types of data coming together, and then optimize the way that you do your analysis in the lab. So to pull it apart again, so the integrated lab would, in my view now, compose of 3 important components. So the data collection and the harmonization. So the collecting, it's not very straightforward. I think we have heard a couple of talks already that it can be quite hard. So you have to parse unstructured data. And ideally, we would also want to normalize this data. And I would consider a SQL-like relational database to be the best way to do this for other scientists to work, again, with this data. And then you can think about a sort of a modular open source and processing and diagnostic suite, because I think it boils down to just a couple of methods, statistical transformations that are often used by these vendors. And then, of course, online monitoring, I think that would also be an important aspect. So you can have your dashboards in the lab, you can sort of track your long-term reproducibility and do also the troubleshooting when something goes wrong. And that is often a little bit obscure. But I'm going to leave that for now and just focus a little bit on the collecting and harmonization. So yeah, we've seen already a couple of talks, custom solutions are being made. But it can be quite hard sometimes. So you have to decipher this vendor's data model. It's labor intensive, multiple files, many observations, inconsistent syntax. I really have seen this, like variables in different files have different names. And then the vendor can all of a sudden decide to change the software or the data model, and all the work was for nothing. And you have to patch it up again. So what we want is maybe more of a universal solution. Just to give you an idea of the data that I have encountered, this is not a real data set, but how it could look like. So often you have like text data, encoded or decoded, so raw data, or just real actual text files. And you can see that it's like lines interspersed with tabular data. So there seems to be some consistency in there. So you could think about segmentation of these, the variables and then the values and your units. But it can be quite cumbersome to come up with these custom solutions. So what I propose now, and I don't know if it is realistic or not, but maybe you can give me some input, is 3 possible solutions with a varying degree of human intervention. I think the first one would be very simple, would just be a sort of a regex-based solution to aid the location of these variables in a sort of the context as well, like the tables or the lines where you can find them. The next 2 solutions, I would suggest, or I have a hunch that maybe we could look at natural language processing, like the analysis of text, to come with solutions. Can we maybe find some universal rules in that sort of data output? Or can you maybe even go one step further and use something like a self-supervised machine learning algorithm to deconvolve these unstructured data sets? So for 3 minutes, huh? Yeah. So for IRADS to come into the picture, so I think it would work then as a subsystem for the automatic ingest. You could also think about automated workflow and the better collaboration, as I already in the beginning of the talk sort of signposted. So the reviewer that wants to have the raw data, I think that would be an excellent way to integrate it also with IRADS then. And as accessibility, I think it would also be for the scientists in the lab, be useful to have interfaces for R and Python. that can also be used standalone. So I really just want to get this data in my local environment. So for now, the solution that I have in mind with my working title, Panacea. So I think it would be a C++ solution for the optimal performance of a large data set. And then you can maybe think of R and Python bindings for the scientists to start work with that. I just want to mention briefly also that we have been working, so with Terrell and Corey, about with the bindings for R, but then based on the C++ API of iRods. But it seemed a bit complex or too complex for an R solution. So in the future, we are thinking about using the REST API in a pure R solution. To make iRods also more accessible for a larger public, I would say. So the roadmap, as I have it in mind now, is gather input. That would be what I'm doing now. Maybe also a workshop in the future, come up with a sort of a white paper maybe for how to move forward with this, develop the software, then also roll it out in a laboratory to see if it actually works. If people also want to use it, that's also very important. And then we can expand to the other tools that I suggested before. So that has to do with, for instance, monitoring the lab processes. So long-term goals, the integrated lab will be more efficient lab processes and innovations maybe in the future. So better open science practices, inclusive science. And I think also if we could work on a solution like this, which is more universal, it might also push the industry, which is very reluctant to adopt to these more open science practices. I actually discussed with manufacturers that would push them to that direction maybe if we take matters in our own hands. This is my last slide. Made a website just before the conference, which you can visit. Also make my just Gmail email account there. So please really do contact me if you have any ideas about how to progress with this.
All right. Thanks, Martin. Maybe we can take one question.
So the way I understood it is it all starts at the black box information from the vendors. Do you have any idea how open they are to work together with you guys in the labs to make their data sets more transparent?
Yeah,
their raw data?
I just talked with one manufacturer, and I think some people there are really concerned about this and they would want to do it, but from the top, there is no real incentive to change this. There are often also licenses involved with this software, so they don't really want to do that. But maybe in a sort of a collaborative effort, if we move forward on this, they would change their mind in the future. I'm not sure. That's my wishful thinking at the moment.
Let's grab the mic here and so that we can capture a question.
For example, some of the brands that you mentioned, when they bring these machines, for example, sometimes they come with you can order a database, or they come with a database as well.
Yeah. So in my experience with one of these vendors, they don't have that, but yeah, I can imagine that some do that, and some have also more accessible formats as data output, as we also heard yesterday with the Onyx, the XML output. So
this Thermo Fisher also, they also have their own. They can build the database in your machine as well. For instance. So once you have the database, then it comes to how you interact with this database, right?
Yeah, well, but it's not in all cases so that you have a database or an accessible data source. You really work with this often binary data or just text output.
But for example, to be inspired, one of the example you gave, you gave one of your outputs, basically it was some type of spectral information in that text file and similar things.
Yeah.
For instance, just to give an idea, okay, those things happened a long time ago, but for instance, right, in the astronomical databases, basically what they do is this: they store all this type of spectral or all this type of data with any type of parameters on like simple SQL database, or and then you can just go and query and get the data in with the, let's say, quality flags attached to it or whatever metadata you want, thousands of them. And
but then it also depends which machine or which manufacturer they want to purchase. So maybe you have to then think before you purchase a machine in the lab whether they also have a very open data model or not.
I mean, if you're able to take out this data, so then you have to have, I mean, your own little bit team to invest, right, to create it.
This is labor intensive when you want to really make this into a format that you can really do your data analysis on.
It's a community effort, actually.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Thanks, Martin.